Okay, let's dive in. You know that feeling, right? When you have a pile of articles, maybe some notes about something really complex, and you just wish someone could, I don't know, sit down with you, pull out the really essential stuff, and kind of show you why it all matters. Well, that's pretty much what we aim to do here on the Deep Dive. We take the sources you provide, and together we sort of navigate through all that information to find those key insights, maybe some surprising connections you didn't see at first. And for this particular deep dive, you've shared material that centers on a pretty compelling case involving a Professor Mahmood Abad in India. So our mission today is simple. Dive deep into these specific sources, the ones you sent over, really unpack the details to understand the key events, the accusations flying around, the defense points that were made, and the broader picture as it's laid out in this material.
Exactly. We're looking specifically at a set of sources you gave us, detailing a legal challenge faced by a professor over in India. It seems to be mainly related to things he posted online on social media. So we'll navigate this information, focusing strictly on what the material itself highlights as significant and why, aiming to give you a clear picture drawn straight from these sources you shared.
Great. So let's jump right in. According to the material, who exactly is this central figure, Professor Mahmood Abad?
The sources identify him clearly as a political science professor. He teaches at Ashoka University.
Okay, political science professor. And the core situation he's dealing with, how do the sources describe that?
Well, according to the material, Professor Abad is facing some serious legal charges. And these charges, they stem directly from his social media activity. He's currently under investigation by what the sources call a special investigation team, or an SIT for short. The sources are quite specific on the main accusation, mentioning he's accused of classical sedition. And they also state that, as it's presented in the material, the burden of proof is actually on him to prove his innocence.
Wow, okay. Classical sedition, that's a heavy term. Diving into the specifics from the material, what did the sources tell us about the actual posts? What content led to these accusations, and why was it seen as controversial, at least according to the material you looked at?
Right. The sources do give some detail on the content. They state, for instance, that the posts included negative comments about the Indian judiciary. The material also seems to highlight one post in particular as being, complex, maybe multi-layered. It apparently praised the Indian military for actions against a neighbor identified as Pakistan. But at the same time, it also criticized Pakistan for harboring terrorists. So kind of a nuanced take there, it seems. Another key point that comes up in the sources is criticism of India's stance, its international stance, specifically regarding Muslims. The material uses the word hypocrisy in relation to this and suggests Abad portrayed India as hostile towards Muslims in that context.
Okay. That sounds like a fairly wide range of topics just in those posts. What about the specific legal charges tied to them? What did the sources list?
The sources detail several distinct accusations. They mention disturbing public peace, specifically through his Facebook posts, also spreading hatred against religious groups. And another one mentioned is insulting the dignity of women, which the sources apparently link somehow to disturbing public security.
Insulting the dignity of women linked to public security. Interesting framing.
Yes, and the material also makes sure to point out where these accusations came from, noting a member of the ruling party, the BJP, was involved, and also connecting it to a group referred to in the sources simply as the Women's Committee. That connection seems to be presented as significant in the material's narrative.
Absolutely. Those are definitely serious and kind of layered accusations as the material lays them out. So moving on, what do the sources you provided say about Professor Abad's response? Or, his defense against these points?
The documents we looked at indicate that speaking through his lawyers, his posts were described in a particular way. They were framed as causing surprise, potentially being misleading.
Misleading how?
Well, misleading because they were complex. That was the argument presented, according to the sources. His legal team apparently argued that the language he used, it needed careful definition, and that the onus, the responsibility for clarifying that language should fall on the police.
Okay, so shifting the burden of interpretation.
Sort of, yeah. The sources also state that Professor Abad did turn himself in for the investigation. He cooperated to that extent. But then, as the investigation seemed to deepen, the material shows he then went to the Supreme Court, seeking relief.
Ah, the Supreme Court. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Pulling from those sources, what happened with that request? What was the outcome?
Well, according to the material provided, the Supreme Court turned him down. They rejected his request for relief.
Rejected it flat out.
Seems so. And the sources actually include some reported comments from the court itself, which are pretty striking. The court apparently questioned whether Abad had even read his own posts and sort of whether he was genuinely endorsing the viewpoints in them.
Questioned if he'd read them. Wow.
Yeah. And the court is quoted in the material as saying that they could analyze the language used. They observed that while Abad's words, might seem innocent just looking at them.
On the surface, yeah.
Exactly. On the surface. But they suggested the words were likely aimed at a very specific audience and could potentially contain, quote, double meanings or hidden messages. That focus, from the court's perspective, as presented in the sources on potential hidden intent, rather than just the literal words, that seems like a really significant point in the material.
That detail about double meanings, yeah, the sources really seem to emphasize that specific angle from the court. Now, something else the material mentioned, the timing of the SIT, the Special Investigation Team. It was formed before the posts were formally reviewed, is that right?
That's what the sources state, yes.
So what does that timing suggest, according to the picture the sources are painting here?
Well, as it's framed in the sources you shared, this specific detail about the SIT being formed before a formal review, it's presented as suggesting, perhaps, that the decision to investigate might have been made beforehand. Or at least it's presented in a way that raises questions about, let's say, the process or the fairness of the investigation itself. That's the perspective offered in the material. It seems to be a point the sources want to underscore.
Right, that definitely adds another layer of complexity to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, let's step back a bit. What about the broader context? What do the sources present regarding the significance of this case beyond just the immediate legal stuff? Why does this particular case stand out, according to the material?
The sources frame this case primarily as highlighting what they see as potential suppression of academic freedom, and the targeting of dissenters, people who disagree, within what the material explicitly calls the Hindu nationalist system. The sources suggest, based on the information provided, that this process might even involve support from elements within the police and the judiciary. That's a strong claim made in the material. The sources also bring in Professor Abad's personal background. They make a point of noting he is a religious Muslim and comes from a conservative background. This seems presented as relevant to the overall narrative in the sources.
Okay, connecting his identity to the wider context, what else did the material add to that picture?
It points out something about the media coverage, that it sometimes focused very heavily on his criticism of Pakistan.
Ah, right, you mentioned that earlier.
Yes, and the sources suggest this focus might have actually confused the main issue, muddied the waters of the case, so to speak. Also, that specific accusation of disrupting the public order, the sources highlight this. They describe it as a tactic similar to those allegedly used in other situations to silence academics, framing them, the sources say, as enemies of this nationalist system. The sources even mention a specific detail that a spokesperson for the youth wing of the BJP, known as the ABVP, publicly announced that steps would be taken against Abad. The material seems to present this as, further evidence pointing towards political motivation.
And amidst all that, what about the perspective of his supporters? How is that represented in the sources?
The material notes that despite all these serious charges, his supporters, based on the information we have, they hold the view that the police should really stick to the evidence, just the facts, and that the judiciary should uphold fairness above all. They reportedly connect Professor Abad's words, his expressions, to broader concepts like Muslim dignity, justice, fairness, and equality. So according to the sources, they're framing his speech within those larger ideas.
Okay, so looking at everything we've pulled from these sources, the specific content of the posts, the multiple, quite varied accusations, the defense arguments about complexity, the Supreme Court's perspective focusing on intent and those double meanings, the interesting timing of the SIT formation, and this broader context the sources paint involving academic freedom, political dynamics, religious identity. What this all seems to mean, based purely on the material you've shared, is that we're seeing a really, really complex interplay. It's like layers of legal, political, and social forces all colliding in this one specific situation. So we've taken quite a deep dive into the sources you provided about this case involving Professor Mahmoud Abad. We've navigated through the specific accusations laid out, the defense points presented in the material, the court's reported perspective, including that really fascinating detail about double meanings, and also the broader context the source is connected to, touching on academic freedom and political dynamics, all drawn directly from the material you shared with us.
Yeah, and I think Understanding cases like this by pulling these insights directly from the sources and seeing how all the different elements connect, the legal charges, what was actually in the post, the political backdrop described, the court's specific interpretation, it really helps us see the sheer layers of complexity involved in real-world situations where expression, academic or otherwise, bumps up against the law, especially as it's all presented in this particular set of materials.
It really is a compelling case study, based on everything you've given us, in just how expression can be interpreted, challenged, and debated within a specific legal and political framework.
Absolutely. And based on all these different facets presented in the sources, this really leaves us with an important question for you to think about. Given these multiple perspectives and all the details laid out in the material, from the accusations and the court's viewpoint on intent to the defense arguments and the broader context framed by the sources regarding politics and academic freedom, how do you personally evaluate the relationship between academic expression and the legal challenges described in the specific case based solely on the information presented here?